Hello again, everyone. Welcome to part 4 of our Chapter 25 lecture series for your textbook, Give Me Liberty by Dr. Eric Foner. This section is entitled The Changing Black Movement. The focus question for this section is, how did the civil rights movement change in the mid-1960s? The civil rights movement entered a distinct new phase when it moved from demanding equal access and/or opportunity to trying to address economic disparities between the races. Desegregation did not solve those economic issues. Many whites who were sympathetic to desegregation left the civil rights movement in general after achieving the goals of desegregation. They felt that African Americans were now equal before the law and needed no further assistance. On the other hand, many blacks felt that desegregation and equal access was just the start to dealing with racial disparities and called for further action. As the civil rights movement shifted away from issues of segregation and moved towards issues of economic disparities, there also was a shift away from the more nonviolent approach and attitudes of Martin Luther King Jr. and other civil rights leaders like him towards more of an acceptance of violence as a legitimate tool to fight against racial injustice. And this was reflected in the phenomenon of urban uprisings of African Americans in the mid-1960s. And these were full-scale, battles between blacks and mostly white police in many urban areas. The first significant urban riot was in Harlem, New York in 1964. In 1965, there were the Watts riots in LA, California. And this was the largest of these urban uprisings in this period. Over 50,000 rioters were involved in this uprising that led to 35 deaths, 900 injured, and $20 million in property destroyed. And just to give you an idea of the magnitude of that property destruction, in today's money adjusted for inflation, that $20 million would equal $168,175,873 in property damage. There were also significant uprisings in Newark, New Jersey, and Detroit, Michigan in 1967. The situation got so dire that many feared that a racial civil war was about to be upon the United States. And the LBJ administration commissioned a congressional report to look into the causes of these riots and propose some plans on what can be done to address the issues underlying these events. This was the Kerner Report, and the Kerner Report blamed the riots on segregation, poverty, and white racism. And they claimed that society was becoming harshly divided along racial lines. A little ironic considering that society was just beginning to emerge from Jim Crow-era segregation, which legally divided society along racial lines in many parts of the United States, of course, particularly in the South. This period also saw the emergence and the rise of a new type of African American leader that embraced the more militant aspects of the civil rights movement in the period. Probably the most notable of these was Malcolm X. Malcolm was an incendiary speaker and a member of the radical anti-white, pro-black Muslim group, the Nation of Islam. And Malcolm and his adherents insisted that blacks must control the political and economic resources of their own communities and rely on their own efforts rather than working with whites, essentially outlining a program of sort of self-imposed segregation for the black community. In 1964, Malcolm actually had a change of heart, an epiphany, if you will. In that year, he participated in the Hajj, which was the Muslim practice of at least once in a Muslim's lifetime they must visit the holy city of Mecca in Saudi Arabia. And Malcolm did so in 1964, and there he met Muslims from a wide variety of racial and ethnic backgrounds. And this began to open his eyes that his sort of anti-white rhetoric was maybe not the best path forward for the fight for racial justice in the United States. And as such, he began to distance himself from the more militant rhetoric of the Nation of Islam and actually left that organization and began an organization of his own that embraced interracial cooperation. Well, in 1965, members of the Nation of Islam, angered over Malcolm's defection from their organization, assassinated Malcolm X, ending his career in the civil rights movement. The shift towards a more militant tone in the overall civil rights movement in the mid to late 1960s was best exemplified in the rise of a new movement, the Black Power movement. The idea was still somewhat imprecise and not fully articulated yet, but it reflected the radicalization of civil rights activists and sparked racial self-assertion, racial pride, and a rejection of white norms among many African Americans. In 1966, the Black Panther Party was formed by Bobby Seale and Huey P. Newton in Oakland, California. And this party fully embraced this more militant Black Power ideology. And this group advocated for black armed self-defense against white violence. This stance alarmed many moderate blacks and many whites and fueled the fears of a potential upcoming racial civil war. That concludes part 4 of our Chapter 25 lecture series for your textbook, Gimme Liberty by Dr. Eric Foner. As always, study hard, and I'll see you soon.